We're quite privileged to have today as our presenter John List. John is the Science of Philanthropy Initiative Director, Project Leader, and Principal Investigator. List's research focuses on answering questions about human behavior through the lens of economic theory and through the generation of data in naturally occurring field settings. List is a leading expert in the growing field of economics of philanthropy. He's published over a dozen research studies in peer-reviewed journals that utilize large-scale field experiments to investigate the motives of charitable giving. His research has appeared in such publications as the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Chronicle of Philanthropy. Professor List is chairman of the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. He received his BS from the University of Wisconsin and his PhD from the University of Wyoming. John?
Thanks a lot, John, for that introduction. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. What I'm going to do is walk through this slide deck, and if at the end you have any questions about these slides or about other broader issues of the economics of charity or charitable fundraising in general, please send them my way. Okay, so what I'll be doing is I'm going to start by talking about some facts on the charitable market, and then I will go through some field experiments. Now, my goal here is kind of modest. It's to teach you at least one thing that you didn't realize you wanted to know. Okay, so if I am able to accomplish anything, I hope I can accomplish that goal. I'm going to start by going back to my golf roots and ask you, would Tiger Woods actually practice like this? Okay, what we have here is a golfer hitting golf balls into a tarp, and he is not able to see those golf balls flying out into the distance and seeing if they fade or slice or what have you. Okay, so that should be in the back of our minds as we move forward. So the way economists think about the charitable market is they feel that this is a market with three major players. You have the government on the one hand. The government's actions affect donors or solicitees, but government actions also affect the charities themselves. Now, when you look at the donors and solicitees, their behavior not only affects how government bodies make rules, but they also affect what public goods charities provide. And then on the third, or what I think is the most important element of the charitable sector, are the charities themselves. And that's the folks who are likely on this call. Now, my own research has focused on the relationship between the donor and the solicitor, this bottom arrow on the slide. So that's where I'll be focusing the discussion on today. But before moving there, I want to just give you a quick glimpse of the macro view of what total giving by source over time looks like. What I have here are a bunch of bars that give you the dollars of charitable contributions in billions of dollars. So as you can see here, we've had tremendous growth, and in the last 5 or so years, we've had a leveling off between 2002 and 6 versus 2007 to 11. Now, what these bars also suggest is how important individual donations have been in the charitable sector. You can see that the blue parts of these bars have really grown over time. Bequest foundations and corporations has also shown some growth, but not as great as the individual giving. Okay, one way to think about the time series is on this very next slide, where I have total giving in dollars indexed to 1971, and I have that overlaid on the S&P 500. So the idea here is to look at growth in charitable giving and compare it to something that an economist would think is important, and that's the S&P 500. So as you can see here, both of these indices have grown by about 12 to 14 times. So what that means is that compared to 1971, charitable giving is about 12 times greater in real terms than it was in 1971, And this growth is comparable to the growth that we've observed in private companies as indexed by the S&P 500. Now, as you can see, what's kind of interesting in this time series is that over time, total giving sort of goes up every year. But what we see in the S&P 500 is that there's a lot more variance. And if you look at from 1997 until now, the S&P 500 has actually gone down. And in fact, if you look at from 2007 to 2011, S&P 500 has also gone down. Over the same time period, charitable gifts have gone up considerably, 2 or 3 times. Okay, now another fact is what's brought up by the Economist in 2004, and that's that there's an extraordinary amount of money available. The lack is of good ideas on how to get the basket under the apple tree. Okay, so that's more or less where I come in, and when I first started doing research in this area in 1998, what I learned is that many fundraisers rely more on anecdotes rather than science. Okay, so just to turn back the clock, in 1998, I was an assistant professor at the University of Central Florida, and the dean at the University of Central Florida approached me and asked me if I could raise money for a Center on Environmental Policy Analysis. And what the dean told me is that if you go ahead and try to raise money for this center, that I will give you $5,000 in seed money in an effort to help you raise more money for the center. So, of course, what I did is I said, when you're engaged in a large capital project, what are the first steps that you should put in place to ensure that you have a popular or a successful capital campaign? So number one was secure a fraction of the money privately before going public. So as an economist, I'm very quantitative, and what I want to know is, well, what is the optimal fraction? What fraction of the money should I raise in private before going public? And what I found was that really the answers were all over the map. The fundraising school, for example, recommends that 40 to 50% of the goal should be pledged before the public campaign begins. Other handbooks recommend figures between 20 and 50%. When you look at the University of Wisconsin's Kohl Center, before they actually started construction of their basketball facility, which is magnificent, they ended up raising $27 million in private before going public for the rest of their goal, which was essentially, we want to raise $72 million for the Kohl Center. Okay, so essentially the experts were telling me that exactly how much money you should raise beforehand varies between 20 and 50%. And I asked, what is the empirical evidence for 20%? Or what is the empirical evidence for 50%? And no one had that empirical evidence. So, of course, what I'm going to do is to operationalize that idea of trying to figure out, first of all, does seed money work? And secondly, what is the optimal fraction of money I should raise in private before I go public? I decided to split this initial capital campaign into several smaller capital campaigns. So essentially what I realized was that SEPA needed 6 computers before we started our operations. So I split up our SEPA capital campaign into 6 smaller campaigns to raise money for these computers. And this first experimental idea is a direct mail solicitation. Okay, so here's exactly what the experiment looked like. I had 10,000 households which had given money to the University of Central Florida before. So let's consider these warm households. In group 1, these households received a letter that said, we are trying to fund a computer for $3,000, and we've already raised 10% of that $3,000 from a private donor. Now what we're coming to you to do is to raise the additional $2,700. Okay, in group 2, households who were randomly put in this group received the exact same letter, but it said that we had raised 33% of the money in private. So now we're asking for $2,000. In group 3, we tell them that we've raised 2/3 of the money in private. And now we're asking you for the $1,000. In group 4, they just received a solicitation letter, and there's no mention of seed money at all. Okay, so that's how simple this first experiment is using 10,000 households. So what are the results? What we found is that seed money worked really, really well. And in fact, the more seed money we had, the more gifts the more money we raised. But interestingly, what happened was more people gave, the higher the level of seeds, and those who gave actually gave more. So it was both on what economists call the intensive margin, people give more, and the result was on the extensive margin that more people gave. And our theoretical model that was most consistent with these data was that the seed money signaled the value or the credibility of the program that we called SEPA. So seed money was operating to ensure people that this was actually a good project and something that they should invest their scarce resources in. Okay, so that leads us to the next question. If we have upfront money, is it better used as a match? A lot of times we hear about a one-to-one match. Or should we simply announce that we have seed money as we did in our SEPA experiment? So the idea here is that if you have $1 million from Bill Gates, do you tell people we've just secured $1 million, now we need to raise more money? That would be the seed money approach. Or should we say Bill Gates has just given us $1 million to use for matching, and now every dollar you give, we will match with a Gates dollar. This is a one-to-one match. So we put this question into operation with a simple mail solicitation with the Sierra Club of Canada. And this experiment had 4 treatments. We don't need to talk about the 2 controls now. But it had a seed money treatment, exactly as SEPA, and it had a one-to-one matching treatment. So every $100 that a person gave was matched by $100 from an anonymous donor. And what we were trying to raise money for was a green teaching program in grammar schools in British Columbia. Now, what we find is, again, that seed money works really well. But here we find that the one-to-one match also works really well. But seed money slightly outperformed that one-to-one match. So the overarching finding here is that upfront money works really well to raise more money. Seed money partly, let's say, or weakly outperforms a one-to-one matching program. So what you might want to ask is, well, wait a second here. You just did a test, seed money against a one-to-one match. What if you did that same kind of test, but you varied the match instead of one-to-one, you used a 2-to-1 match or a 3-to-1 match? And there's a wonderful, what I call the Bible of fundraising, Kent Dove's book, warns us that you should never underestimate the power of a challenge gift, and that obviously a one-to-one match is more appealing than a 1-to-2 challenge, and a richer challenge greatly adds to the match's attractiveness. Now, when I think about this particular statement, this is sort of like Econ 101. If you raise the price of a good, people will consume fewer of those goods. But if you lower the price of a good, of course they will purchase more of those goods. And this intuition was seen when you look around the globe. You see examples where donors give, say, $50 million in the case of the grant gift to Drake University. And the donor said, you need to use my money to spur further gifts, and you need to do that by using a 2-to-1 and a 3-to-1 matching solicitation. So this is around the idea that if you use a greater or more rewarding match, more people will give, and they will give more money. Now the question, however, is this result true? Is it true that a 3-to-1 is better than a 1-to-1, and a 1-to-1 is better than a 1-to-2 challenge? Back in 2000, when I looked at the literature, there was very little evidence that indeed the match race worked in accordance with this particular quote, which is what I call Econ 101. So that leads us to our next experiment, which is on the match test. And this is an experiment with a national liberal nonprofit in the US, which I am not at liberty to tell you the exact name of this nonprofit due to a non-confidentiality agreement. Okay, but essentially what this is we're sending letters to their prior donors and we're asking them for money. And in this particular experiment, an anonymous donor gave us a pot of money to use as matching funds, and we sent out about 50,000 letters. And what we varied was the match rate. It was either 3-to-1, 2-to-1, 1-to-1, or no match. We also had the maximum match amount. So we told people that we had either 100,000, 50,000, 25,000 available in match money, or we didn't state what was available. Okay? So the very simple match experiment is given on this slide. We're essentially randomizing these households either into group 1, group 2, group 3, or group 4. And group 4 does not receive a match offer at all. In here, if you're in group 1, you're in a 1-to-1 match. If you're in group 2, you're in a 2-to-1 match. If you're in group 3, you're in a 3-to-1 match. So this next slide shows you exactly how easy it is to run this particular experiment. Okay, the solicitation letters were identical. The only thing we changed was this insert card. And here's how the insert card read. Troubled by the continued erosion of our constitutional rights, a concerned member has offered a matching grant, and this is the amount, 25, 50, 100,000, or blank, to encourage you to contribute to blank at this time. To avoid losing the fight to defend our blank, this member has announced the following match: $1, $2, or $3 for every dollar you give. So this means for every, what HPC means is highest previous contribution times 1, or highest previous contribution times 1.25. For every dollar you give, we will actually receive X. So let's not lose this match. Please give today. Okay, so this is exactly how easy it is to test whether a 3-to-1 is better than a 2-to-1, and whether a 2-to-1 is better than a 1-to-1 match, and whether a 1-to-1 match is better than no match at all. Okay, so let's find out what happens. The first major result from this experiment is that if you just look at all the matching treatments together, so what I'm doing is I'm pooling the 1-to-1, the 2-to-1, and the 3-to-1 match treatment data. What you find is when you have a match available, you raise about 19% more money than if you don't have a match available. Okay, so you can ask, where exactly is that effect operating? And that effect is operating entirely on the extensive margin. And what I mean by that is when you have a match available, more people decide to give money. In this case, they don't decide to give more money. They just decide to give money rather than giving nothing. So what we find in the matching treatments is that about 22% more people actually send us a check. Now, when you look across the 3-to-1, 2-to-1, and 1-to-1 match treatments, what we find is that there is no effect of the higher match. So what that means is that the 3-to-1, the 2-to-1, and the 1-to-1 all raise about the same amount of money. So if you go back to the fundraising Bible quote, in our particular data set, that does not manifest itself. And now we've run the same experiment 2 or 3 times over, and we have a very hard time finding that the match rate itself influences the amount that people give. But what does affect what people give is that if there is a match in place, people will respond to that match. Okay? So we can think of other uses of upfront money. You know, if you have a pot of upfront money, maybe you want to buy prizes for auctions or use lotteries. And the lottery that I have in mind is every dollar you give, you have a ticket to perhaps win a $1,000 gift card to Best Buy. Now, what we found is that that particular technique works very, very well. If you link the probability of winning a prize to how much money they give, we've raised anywhere from 50 to 100% more money when you use a lottery-based approach. And this is largely due to more people giving to the public good rather than the fact of those people who would give otherwise, they give more. So that doesn't happen. More people give, or this is an extensive margin result. You could also think about using upfront money to buy donor gifts. Now, what I'm thinking about here is maybe a bookmark, a token of your appreciation to a past donor. What we found is that these types of gifts work very well, but the ROI is much higher for coldless people than it is for warmless people. In fact, what we find is that gifts don't work very much at all for warmless people, but they work very effectively for coldless people. In fact, using a gift, in our experiments, it makes a coldless person look like a warmless person. Of course, that's exactly what we want to do as fundraisers. So let's go through some lessons learned. Upfront money is very important. Seed money works, matches work as well. We've had a lot of trouble finding strong evidence of the match rate mattering. Non-price incentives can have very strong effects on givers. These are gifts and such tokens of your appreciation. And this is exactly what number 2 leads into. A small donor gift is a useful substitute for a warm list. Now, what we've been finding is these experiments tend to be over several years of giving. So we not only see what affects people giving for the very first time, but we can also look at their giving rates over time. And what we find is that the incentive that you use to induce people to give the very first time is very important in determining whether they are continual givers or whether they're just one-off givers. What we also find is that these one-size-fits-all campaigns likely are leaving millions of dollars on the table. Now, one result is that men are very price sensitive, and women aren't that price sensitive. Now, what I mean by that is when you look at changes in tax rate, or if you look at changes in matching rates, the men are much more responsive than those prices than are the typical women. Now, what women are very responsive to is pleas to altruism and social pressure. So it seems like men are responding to prices and women are responding more to things like altruism and social pressure. Now, what we've also found is that insights from behavioral economics can really help us raise a lot more money. And this is an example that I want to end today on by looking at this Smile Train example. So Smile Train is a wonderful charity based in New York that raises money to fix children in developing countries that look like the child on your screen that has a cleft palate. Okay, so this particular drive was done in collaboration with Smile Train, and we call it Give Now and We Will Never Bother You Again. So over several years, we have touched more than 800,000 people in a mail solicitation, telling some of them that if you make one gift now, we'll never ask for another donation again if you check this box. Now, in the very first experiment that Smile Train ran, what we found is that in that experiment, we raised much more money. We raised about $60,000 from those people who we gave the once and done treatment versus about $21,000 to those people who were not in the once and done treatment, who were in a control treatment. And there were the same numbers of people in each of the two treatments. But 34% of people checked the box. So roughly 1 out of 3 people tell us, here's some money, but please never contact me again. And of course, we can't contact those people again. But what happens is the people who don't check the box in the future end up giving more to Smile Train. They end up giving about $52,000, whereas the group in the control give about $35,000 in the future. So this very first once and done experiment, what you find is that people who are given that opportunity to cut off the line of communication, they end up giving more money now, and they give more money in the future. So of course we replicated that several times, and what the typical drive leads to is about 100% higher, more money is raised initially, and future streams are roughly similar across a once and done group and the baseline group. So the very first experiment was giving us data that was much more optimistic than the truth. I think the truth is about you raise about twice as much money using once and done in the initial drive, and the future streams of money are about the same. Now note that the once and done treatment, it raises the same amount of money in the future as the control group, but you spend less money in solicitations because you're reaching out to roughly 34% fewer people than you are in the control group. Okay, so all the experiments that we've talked about so far is amongst these donors who tend to give no more than $500. So you can say, do these tricks work with the bigger fish? Now, what I can say is that most organizations do not let me or my group near these large donors, but one group has recently. And we've just started a set of experiments with the Chicago Booth School of Business to explore if larger capacity donors are more price sensitive than the smaller donors that we've been finding. So for example, maybe a large donor herself will respond more to a 3-to-1 match than a 1-to-1 match, whereas smaller donors might not respond to that match change. So that's what we're exploring right now, and at this point I don't have any data to talk about. Okay, so summing up. Let's now go back to Tiger and ask ourselves, would we want to practice like this? And the bottom line is, of course we want practice like this. What we want to do is we want to try new things, and we want to see if those new things work. So you think about Tiger. You can watch Tiger on a driving range, and he's a feedback maximizer. What he'll first start with is a narrow swing, and then he'll look at 2 outputs, club head speed and ball speed. And then he'll look at the most important output. That drive just went 250 yards, and it ended up in the fairway. Tiger might then say, okay, let's try a little wider swing. And now let me look at those 2 intermediate outputs, club head speed and ball speed, and then let's see where the drive actually goes. In this case, with a wider swing, I'm hitting the ball much farther, and it's still going straight. When I talk to fundraisers, they are acting typically more like Tiger beating golf balls into a tarp and not experimenting with what works and what doesn't work, rather than being good feedback maximizers. Now you can say, okay, how can I step into this world of the scientific method, and how can I myself use the scientific method to not only help exactly my cause that I'm trying to work on, but also to help revolutionize this sector. That's what I envision is a scientific method is a driving force to revolutionize the charitable sector, which I said earlier was extremely important. It represents about 2 to 3% of GDP in our economy today. So I would say to begin, you should always have a control group and you should always randomize. Again, what I mean by that is you have households, put some households randomly into a control group, put some households randomly into a treatment of interest or a set of treatments. Make informed decisions on the number of treatments and the sample size requirements. I have some very simple formulas that if you email me, I can send you. The very first question that people ask me is, well, how big does my sample size need to be? And I have some simple responses to that I can send along later. Understand how to analyze the data. Many times after we receive a pile of data, we have a very little, let's say, good plan on how we want to analyze, present, and interpret those data. We need to know exactly how we're going to be interpreting the data before we can actually design an experiment. And also have a plan for building on past experimental results. So when I talk to some, let's say, frontier fundraisers who actually want to use a scientific method, many times they have one idea that will not build itself into a general recognition of what their donors want and what their donors will respond positively to. Now, what I've talked about today is a plan of how you use upfront money. So think about my University of Central Florida experience. I first of all started by my dean giving me $5,000 to use as seed money. I then asked, should I use seed money just as a simple announcement, or should I use that upfront money to fund matching grants? From there, I went to the Sierra Club experiment, and then I went to the matching experiment that I talked about today, where 3 to 1, 2 to 1, and 1 to 1 were both about the same in terms of bringing in money, but those matches all dominated the baseline group. Data that I have not talked about today is number 4. In other work, we also look at match rates of 1 to 3, 1 to 2, and 1 to 1. And what we find here is that those also deliver similar dollar values in terms of performance. Okay, so in the end of the day, I end with some lotteries and some gifts, but I have a series of field experiments that have built on themselves that help to explore what are the optimal ways of using upfront money, and this helped me explain why are people committed to my cause and what keeps them committed to my cause. Now, I would say the next steps to become a feedback maximizer, of course, you can always email me. I am more than willing to work together, help you design experiments, and more or less my payment is that I can use your data to write up academic papers or write about in popular books. Now, I should warn you, though, if you Google me, which many of you might have, I'm not actually related to this horrible John List who did a few things that aren't even worth mentioning on this webinar. But I'm sure some of you are chuckling right now. Now, a paper that I've written on this is why economists should run field experiments and 14 tips for pulling one off. So if any of you want that particular paper, I can send that along if you shoot me an email. And that's a paper that was published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives last year. Now, where I want to end is a project that I am very, very excited about. And John mentioned this at the beginning of the talk. We call it SPY. It's a Science of Philanthropy initiative. And this actually is just starting now. And it's starting based on a very generous gift from the Templeton Foundation. And one of the important goals that we have with SPY is not only to generate new research, but also to distill the layers and layers of academic research that is out there that many of you probably don't even know about. One of our roles with SPY is to distill that literature to a level where practitioners and policymakers can actually visit our website, read a very user-friendly explanation of what academics are finding and what academics are arguing to help you keep your donors not only more engaged, but also to help you build a pyramid of donors that will allow your group to have continued success into the future. So our website, which is now up and running, is www.spyhub.org. And every now and then, hopefully weekly, we will be delivering new content on that website. And we hope that a lot of you reach out as partners to help create information that we can also put on spyhub.org. Okay, John, so that concludes my formal presentation, and I'll be glad to take on any questions that people might have.
John, we do have a couple of questions, but first I want to say, on behalf of everyone attending, thank you. I found it quite fascinating, personally, all the work that you've done here, and that I'm sure everybody got a tremendous amount out of it. So thank you.
You're welcome.
The question come through was, what's the difference between a cold list and a warm list?
Sure. That's a good question. So the way that we have defined it in our data set is that a warm list is a group of people who have given my organization, whichever charity I'm working for, Sierra Club, Smile Train, etc., if they have given a cash gift or if they have volunteered their time within the last 3 years, we call them warm donors. If they have not given for a cause within the last 3 years, we call them cold donors. Now, what you can do is you can further refine the cold list by saying, have they ever given to our organization, which is not so cold, and you can talk about a really cold list, a person who has never given to our organization and who we've never reached out to, an acquisition mailer, for example. But in the data that I've talked about today, I've defined warm list as a person who has given to us in the last 3 years, and a cold list is a person who has not given to us in the last 3 years.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, what is ROI?
So that's a good question. I apologize. ROI is return on investment. So if you would invest $100 and say you would bring in $500, you've essentially multiplied your money fivefold, and you've increased it by 500%. So it'd have a really high ROI. An ROI that's negative is if you spend money right now and you end up raising less money than you spent right now, but also into the future, you've raised less money than you actually spent. And I think many fundraisers who are just getting started, they have projects that have negative ROI at the beginning, and then essentially we hope that it turns into a positive ROI. Otherwise, of course, you will be exiting from the industry very soon.
Very good. Next question is, the folks out there are looking for some recommendations for further reading in this area.
Absolutely. I think that's a good question. So my first point would be to say, go to the SPY website, spyhub.org, and what we have there are several academic papers that are very readable that will give you ideas about the experiments that my team has been running and also experiments that other teams have been running. What you also find on spyhub.org is some distillations of some work that we have executed that will give you a sense in layman's terms of how you can take that academic research and use it as a practitioner. So I would start with spyhub.org. That will include a lot of different papers and a lot of summaries distilled to the practitioner.
Okay, thank you. John, I got one or two more questions here. And then did you do any testing, or would you recommend using matching gifts year after year?
I would. I think a lot of times people would say, look, the match will work very good the first time, but over time, people end up getting accustomed to the match, and the match isn't as effective as it was in the very first rollout. Now, that's true. When you look at data, people are less susceptible to these price changes over time. But what is also true is that they still have a positive return on investment. So matches are still a very useful way to raise money, even if you roll them out to donors who are very experienced, who are very used to these types of approaches. People still respond to the signal of credibility that is gleaned from a match.
Okay. A couple more questions. They keep coming in here. Is it more effective to have a matched donor named or anonymous?
That's a great question. So I know of one academic paper that looks at this, and this is work that Dean Carlin and I have recently done with a development charity, a charity that attempts to raise money for people in developing countries. And our baseline was an anonymous donor, just exactly as the baseline was in these particular experiments that I talked about today. And the treatment group in this case we named Bill and Melinda Gates as the donors who have given the upfront money. Okay, so this very first paper in this area is comparing an anonymous donor to Bill and Melinda Gates. So you should take that at face value. Now, what we find in the data is that if the charity itself is in an area that Bill and Melinda Gates have experienced, and people look to them for leadership in this area, which is exactly giving to developing communities, their gift and naming the gift that it's from Bill and Melinda Gates matters a lot versus if you leave it anonymous. But if it's for a cause that Bill and Melinda Gates are not seen as experts, then naming them has no real influence on people who are potentially going to give money to your cause. So I hope I've been clear with that response. It does matter, but it only matters if the donor herself is viewed as an expert in this area and can give good advice on whether this is a good cause.
Okay, got another one here. When testing into a matching amount 2 times, 3 times, etc., on various levels of seed money, isn't there a risk that having mixed messages out there could risk an organization's credibility? For example, a media outlet found out about the difference in messages. Also, how do you handle the variations when it comes to pointing donors to your website?
Absolutely. So when you think about some specific treatments, like a 2-to-1, 3-to-1, or 1-to-1, that naturally lends itself to a mail solicitation, where the donors themselves are distributed broadly across a large geographic region. You wouldn't want to think about setting that up on your website, especially if a person who you've given a one-to-one match and is a very important donor for you. If they go on the website and see that somebody else is getting a 3-to-1 match, that's obviously not something you want to do. But what I found is that many important donors to our most cherished causes actually want me and want the organization to explore what works and what avenues can we take to make our organization more appealing to people who want to give to charitable causes. So I think in many cases, when I've talked to, in particular, large donors to causes, they appreciate the scientific approach and they want you to actually figure out what works so then their dollars go further.
Okay. All right. Well, John, on behalf of everyone here and all of our attendees today, I just want to say thank you for giving us a fascinating glimpse into solicitations and how to look at things here in a more scientific way. I think everyone got a lot out of it and a lot of good questions. So, on behalf of everyone, I just want to say thank you for your time and thank you for all that you do for philanthropy.
So, John, thanks a lot for having me, and I would like to thank everyone for participating, and I look forward to working with you in the future.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming.